There we go. All right. Thank you so much for being patient. I know you can't have a conference without just a little bit of technical difficulty, but we are all good. So let me share my screen. Make sure I have that going. All right. All right. Do you all see my presentation? All right.
Yep.
All right.
Yes.
All right. So, and just to be clear, this stops at 50, right? At 10:50. Is that right on the schedule?
Yeah, around 10:45, 10:50 is fine.
10:45? All right, perfect. All right, so I'm gonna hop right in. I'm glad that a lot of you all stayed on to continue to dig deeper. This session, we're gonna go even more into the nitty gritty. You could probably imagine that a lot of what we talked about last time was really just to get people to understand the why, like why get into this approach was so important. But as people noticed earlier on, when I asked that question, the how becomes a huge barrier to getting our kids where they need to be. It becomes a huge barrier as to why, even though we believe equity in our hearts and in our minds, it's hard to make equity actually real at the classroom level. So again, I'm going to throw out my Twitter handle and other information for you to follow me there. And any questions you have throughout today's discussion, you can feel free to email me at colin@thinkLaw.us. So I'm going to hop right in. I'm going to talk a little bit about our work and the trainings that we do, but I want to kick this off with another question. I know that CTE teachers in particular are often complaining about, like, man, like it's like critical thinking seems to be such a struggle for a lot of our kids today. So like, I want to just hear from your struggle. So some of you could drop in the chat. We have an intimate room here. So if some of you want to actually like unmute yourself and talk me through the struggle, I'd love to know why is it that critical thinking creates such a challenge when it comes to teaching it in our classrooms? Why is it so funky? What is going on with critical thinking that makes it so challenging?
I think, hi, I'm Miss Fredericks. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I think one of the reasons critical thinking can be a challenge for some of our scholars is because of their experiences and exposures to help them connect dots with situations to get them to think on a higher level order. And also a lot of their what they're exposed to, what at school we show them and teach them one thing, but then at home there's other experiences that they are experiencing. So how do you bring those two experiences together to get the kid to think in a higher level order? So I think that has a lot to do with their exposure and their experiences to be able to develop those skills in them to get them to be able to think higher. So if you're not go.
So I really love what Ms. Fredericks kind of framed there, because what she's saying is like, it's not even that we're like they can't. It's just that a lot of times they might struggle to see the connection between what they actually have coming to us with and what they can do with that within that classroom instructional place. Any other thoughts? You could drop it in the chat, unmute yourself, and share like why when the rubber hits the road is critical thinking hard, challenging to teach to our kids as an explicit skill set.
Stacy, go ahead, Stacy.
Everyone. I think it's because people are so busy trying to get through the curriculum that they don't, I've been in the system like 30 years. I went to CTE high school. I attended public school, New York City all my life. And, in hindsight, I noticed that the way that I was taught as a child is different than the way things are now, in terms of even from, my experience as a teacher, is that, the focus is so much on, are you following the curriculum, make sure the curriculum, that you really don't feel for the freedom to have to go off, of the curriculum to say, okay, let's put some more thought into this, let's get some argument going, until you're told, okay, you can get, now they want you to start putting critical thinking back into the curriculum. So I think for so long, the focus, we're geared to passing exams, passing assessments now, and getting certifications. So, it's taken away from the freedom to have that, the freedom to think loud. Like, and you referenced your daughter earlier, and I can make reference to my daughter who's now her second year in college. And she looked at some of her peers in terms of, like you say, that critical thinking or having the freedom to, challenge your own kids. She said that, the problem with the students is the parents. Like, we have created such a culture that our kids, like, you want them to feel so protected and so comfortable, but you don't let them make mistakes. You don't allow them to fail. You make failure like a mistake, when engineering is all about pushing it until it fails.
Yeah. So interesting about your comments. I didn't know this when I was younger, but apparently my mom had told my third grade teacher that she was no longer allowed to call the house because Colin was talking. Had I known that, I would have just had free reign to do whatever. But like, she just like, you got to figure out how to deal with this idea. And I think, Donna made a comment here in the chat box about like, it's not really all that hard. We got to kind of listen to our kids and meet them where they are, and like be able to deal with kids who are, challenging and whatever. But like, in practice, that actually is hard for certain types of educators, where the classroom space is less about the kid having a voice, and it's more about being able to have control and compliance over what's happening. And if we're being real, there's a reason why like education as a profession, we tend to get better insurance rates. Educators as a whole are more likely to follow the rules. A lot of people become educators because they themselves were served really well by like a compliant type of system. So we got to be really careful about this idea that critical thinking isn't just challenging to teach because we've made it challenging to teach, because we failed to find that grapple and dig into that funk and create a space where disruptors could be framed as innovators within a classroom space, presuming they even have a safe space to be able to disrupt. So I want to break down some of the constructs that come from this thinking like a lawyer model into today's discussion a little bit deeper with you all. I talked a little bit about, my kids, my background living here in Phoenix, being from Brooklyn. But what I didn't really spend the time talking about when it comes to this picture was a very different level of where this all went. Because what really struck me as weird when I was in high school was that here we've got this classroom of these gifted and talented kids who are bused to this school in South Brooklyn. But what blew my mind is that 3 kids from this picture didn't graduate high school. Not grad school, college, but like high school. So how is it that we've got kids that are like dropping out of Brooklyn Tech? We got kids that are dropping out of Edward R. Murrow. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I'm starting to understand, like, how is it that we could sometimes leave brilliance on the table, leave genius on the table? And at the same time, we know we need critical thinkers more than ever. So even if we say, oh, everyone just wants to teach to a test, like the park, if you actually have seen the park exam, you would know you cannot pass this test without higher level critical thinking. It's no longer the kind of fill in the blank, super easy stuff like we did before. When I was growing up, we did those closed passages. We just had to fill in the blank in a reading passage. It's gotten so much deeper. But if you look at what people are looking for, we know we need critical thinking more than ever. We know that the world our kids are going into, between nanotechnology and artificial intelligence and rapid automation, even in fields that are like not where we typically would see automation happen, like engineering, like architecture, even the law. A lot of the jobs of a first-year attorney are starting to be replaced by systems that you get trained to do millions and millions of pages of document review more accurately than humans might be able to. So what I think is so interesting is that we've changed our entire goal. And I think Ms. Thomas might have alluded to this a little bit. It used to be that like, I did this job and now you're going to do this. But now we're in a different kind of space. Now things are developing more rapidly. So if you talk about the concept of a waterless toilet, which is an innovation that is going to make massive difference, massive impact in sub-Saharan Africa, where malaria is still a massive issue. Because if you don't have to worry about the issues around having access to clean water and sort of refreshing this sort of thing, it changes everything. But it also changes the plumbing and pipe fitting industry. So what are we doing when it comes to really being able to be conscious of getting there? Why is it that we still treat critical thinking like it's a luxury good? Well, we talked about the definition for critical thinking. We went through this whole idea of this construct. I want to give you some strategies to actually allow you to use critical thinking as a more seamless part of what we're already doing. And I want to be clear with you all. I think in CTE, everybody knows the 4 C's, right? That's what the 4 C's are. You're like, oh yeah, of course. This is what we focus on all the time in CTE, the critical thinking, the collaboration, the communication, the creativity. And in this case, I'm gonna go ahead and give it the 5th C of COVID, because why are they so close to each other? Who knows? But we know that's not gonna work in our classrooms. But anyway, when we start looking at this idea, we know that we want to see this in our classrooms. We also know that our kids are being evaluated by constructs that don't necessarily line up to that. What I want to make sure that we're clear about is that it's not one thing or the other. Even in CTE, you can still make sure that kids are getting the tools that they need to be able to move forward in the system that requires them to do things a certain way, but with a kind of mindset that allows them to change and redesign the system going forward. So the last time we did this, we talked about that side with no driving in the park. I want to show you this through an actual real life legal case that I could then use as an example of the kind of skills and dispositions that we can use in some content examples throughout CTE, all right? So here we go. And I need y'all to pay attention here, right? Because this is going to be right in front of your face, real life legal case. And I really want to make sure that we're following along here, all right? So we got this kid, 5 years old, Brian. He's 5 years old. He saw his aunt about to sit down in the chair. And just before she sat, he pulled it out. She fell, broke her hip, had all these medical injuries. She turned around and sued her own 5-year-old nephew for battery. Let me say that one more time. Brian is 5 years old. He saw his aunt about to sit down in the chair. Just before she sat, he pulled it out. She fell, broke her hip, had all these medical injuries, turned around and sued her own 5-year-old nephew for battery. A battery happens when you make intentional contact that's harmful and causes damages. So in your gut, presuming Brian could pay, should Brian be liable for battery? Yes or no? Drop it in the chat. Just your quick gut reaction. Should he be liable for battery, presuming he could pay? Yes or no? Yes or no? So we're getting some no's, we're getting some no's, getting some more no's. There's got to be at least one heartless teacher in the room that's like, you know what? Yes. If you're that person, I got Brenda, you're close enough, all right? So I'm going to claim you, Brenda. I'm going to claim you. And Anthony, thanks for riding hard, all right? Thanks for that. So here's the thing. When I do this with educators, when I do this even with students, a lot of times what happens is we say, you know what? You all are all kind of on the same page. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go against that initial gut feeling. We're going to purposefully think about this differently. But to help you do it, I'm going to tell you this. You are the aunt's attorney. The aunt needs your help. You've hired her. She's hired you, and she's going to be required to prove that Brian did this, that Brian is liable for battery. So the one thing I want you to think about right now is this idea of intent. Okay, we can't look in his head and prove he did it on purpose, but I need you to prove intent. And there's a couple of ground rules, all right? So listen up, listen up, listen up. You cannot make anything up. So don't make up any new rules. The second thing is this. We're presuming everything that was said was true. Like there's witnesses, there's people that saw it, and nobody's disagreeing with those basic facts. I'll tell you those facts one more time. What I want you to do with those facts is be the aunt's attorney and tell me the best evidence the aunt is going to use to prove he did it on purpose. So Brian is 5 years old. He saw his aunt about to sit down in a chair. Just before she sat, she fell, broke her hip, had all these medical injuries, and sued him for battery. I want you to give me the best evidence as the aunt's attorney that you can use to prove that he did it on purpose without making anything up. Okay? What's the best evidence? Drop it in the chat. So Stephanie says, well, he clearly saw his aunt about to sit down. What would you add to that? What else? What else happened here? What are the other facts? He went to the chair and pulled it away. Give me some more details. So we know he did it, but I think there's a detail here that can help me prove intent. What's the detail here that matters? Like, how do I know he made a decision? Like, let's talk about that. So I'm trying to define the intent. So I know it was intentional, but like, how can I prove it was intentional? Based on what evidence? What action specifically? If anybody wants to unmute themselves and talk it out, it's kind of a magic word that happens here, right? Brian saw his aunt about to sit. Just before she sat, she fell, he pulled it out and she fell and broke her hip. So, okay, so Julio, you got it. Corrine, you got it. He didn't do it 5 minutes ago. He didn't even do it 5 seconds ago. He did it at the exact moment she was going to sit. So I might go to court and say, Your Honor, Brian is 5 years old. But this particular 5-year-old not only saw his hand about to sit, not only pulled out the chair, but he pulled it out at the very moment she was going to sit. Now, I can't look at his head and prove he did it intentionally. But ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what do you think of it? What do you think? What level of calculation and timing and thoughtfulness is required to pull out the chair at the exact moment that because of this little thing called gravity, she doesn't have no choice but her butt hitting the floor? Now, I know some of y'all have been dying to defend Brian. But do me a favor. If you were a typical 9th grade student defending Brian, what would be the one fact that you think a 9th grader would look at this case where they wouldn't even do any actual analysis? It'll be the one thing to be open and shut, I'm done here. What would be the one fact that would be like, so you know what, Stephanie? That essay, he is 5, might be your whole entire essay response. He is 5, exclamation point, underline, my work here is done. And what are they trying to say when they say he is 5? Probably that 5-year-olds don't understand the consequences of their actions. And I'll give you that. Most 5-year-olds don't purposely try to hospitalize their relatives. Most. My son's different. He's different, okay? But like, most don't. But I can't come with that. I need a better argument. I can't go to court and say it was a joke that went bad. I need something better than that. At the end of the day, if he pulled out the chair on her, and it seems like he timed it and calculated it, he's going to be on the hook. Like, I need something better. Because anybody that can look at this and tell me a different story. You look at this, same exact set of facts, but tell me a different story. What's the different story? Brian saw his hand about to sit just before she sat. He pulled it out. She fell and broke her hip. So we can't make anything up. So we can't say there's a tack in a chair. But what's a different way we can tell that story, though?
So I was going with that his motor skills are not defined. So he did pull out the chair, but his intent might have been to tuck his aunt back in.
So time out. So Stephanie's going to come up with a gentleman in training theory. So she's going to rock with this gentleman in training theory and say, Your Honor, Brian is merely a gentleman in training. He sees his aunt about to sit, so of course he goes to pull out the chair. Of course he pulls it out right when she's going to sit. I mean, isn't that the point? But because he's 5, guess what? 5-year-olds don't have the best depth perception, hand-eye coordination, fine motor skills. I don't know if I believe that, but if I did that by accident, then by definition, it cannot be intentional. That's a beautiful story. That's a beautiful story. I want to go one step further. What's funky about contact here? I got a lot of brilliant kids that throw this thing away because when they get the contact, they're like open and shut. What's the funky part about contact in this case? Why does contact present issues for us in this case? Is there a contact here? Well, it's not direct. He pulled the chair, her butt hit the floor. So unless the chair bone is connected to the butt bone is connected to the floor bone is actually a thing, some kids look at this and say there's no contact. So tell me something. I'm the aunt's attorney again. How do I argue that this should be considered a contact, even though there is no actual touching? How do you get there? How do you make that rationale? How do you make that point? Because there's no touching. So everyone saw what happened here, right? But like, I want to focus on a contact. I want to focus on well, look, I got to prove contact, but there was no touching. I'll give you a sentence frame. What would the world look like if, is a way that we often look at this, right? What would the world look like if something like this was not considered a contact? What would the world look like if, like, what else would be allowable if only direct contact, like Anthony noted, was required to be a battery? What else would be okay?
That would be, excuse me, but that would be dangerous because there's a lot of things that happen within our society that don't have direct contact, but impacts millions.
So straight up, right? Forget about millions. Let's talk about one person. I could throw a brick at your head and be like, well, technically, Your Honor, the brick hit you. Okay, case closed. That's crazy. So even with physical harm, I could run you over with my car and be like, well, that was the bumper that did it. That's also crazy. So there's probably this idea that if I pull out a chair in such a way that basically guarantees your butt's gonna hit the ground, it's no different than me pulling a trigger at point blank range, guaranteed that that's gonna hit your skull. So when I start thinking about this idea of contact, there's this funk, there's this back and forth. Now I wanna go a little bit deeper because I could tell the vibe when you heard this case, yo, this is weird, this is funky. What struck you as weird about this case? What facts really made you look like this is a weird case? This doesn't even make no sense that this even happened. What seemed weird to you about this? So you got this aunt that's doing her own nephew who's only 5 years old. It doesn't make any sense. So let me ask you something. What's really going on? What's the real story here? Why is this lady really suing this little boy? What's the deal? Why is she suing this little boy? What is going on? What's the backstory? Because you know how these things go. There's always maybe this is his 99th time doing something and his parents never hold him accountable, so it's time to teach him a lesson. Maybe this is a whole big insurance sort of scheme going on and we got to make sure that like we're both doing our part to get this come up financially. Maybe there's some family drama. Maybe there's like some funk between Brian's mom and this aunt woman. Maybe Brian is just loaded. Maybe this is the right house to get injured at. Maybe my neck is hurting too while we at it. Here's the thing. I don't care about your theory of the case. Here's what I care about. I care about the fact that, like, if this was like US history, we were asking kids who's the most influential figure of the progressive era, or if this was like some sort of science class and I had to predict what's causing this chemical reaction to occur, even in your CTE classes, what's the number one answer that kids give you when you ask them a question and the answer is not right in front of their face? What's the number one thing that they tell you? Blah. They don't even say, I don't know anymore. They're like, blah, 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 okay? And you're like, all right. But when it comes to this issue of justice and fairness, it's like they'll go to the edge of the earth for Brian. Now, they're seamlessly, sorry about that. Now they're seamlessly making all these connections and inferences and being able to leap way beyond the page. Now they're able to really, are y'all seeing my screen right now? The presentation on it? Let me make sure.
Yeah, it's all good.
You are? Okay, good. Wanted to make sure. All right, so when I start looking at this a little bit deeper, I recognize that there's a lot of funk here. And I can take that funk even further. These predictions and inferences can now get to the point where I'm asking these big picture questions. What would the world look like if you could go around suing people who are 5 years old every time they do a practical joke that goes wrong? On the other hand, what would it look like to go around pulling out chairs on people who get seriously hurt, but they can never recover because of the age of the person that did it to them? Neither is ideal. Which would you prefer to live in? And at that point, what we've done is taken something that's so conceptually simple, you can introduce in elementary school, and brought it up all the way to a level of rigor that's discussed in courtrooms around the country. So I'm going to give you a chance to vote again. We did this analysis. We did the different steps. Anyone changed their mind? Anybody before that said Brian shouldn't be held liable, now it's like, yeah, it's fine, right? If he can pay for it and based off of these facts, like, I'm going to go ahead and find him liable. Anybody change their mind? Anybody change their mind? So, different question. This is civil case. It's not criminal. I know where you believe. I know that you might not think Brian should be liable. How many of you think a judge would still find Brian liable? Specifically, those of you who think that you wouldn't find liable, but a judge would. You wouldn't, but you probably think a judge would. Now, let's be real here. Does that mean that you're irrational? Does that mean that like why is there that difference between what you think should happen and what actually happens? So here's the thing. In the actual case, Brian was found liable. They found that there was no contact, but contact was substantially certain to occur from his actions. They found that he did it on purpose as well. But y'all listen to facts too, but there's something bigger than that. Here's what I want to be clear about. This right here is still not a right answer. This is merely a judge's opinion, a judge's interpretation. So what I'm trying to do, what I urge you all to do is think about your instruction from this standpoint. I can teach my kids to analyze the world as it is, or I can give them the tools to analyze the world as they believe it ought to be, as they believe it ought to be, with their version of what it means to say that doing right is more important than being right. Because if we can do that, y'all all heard that phrase, you can lead a horse to water, but can't make him drink. But when we tap into that sense of fairness and justice, this brings us to a point where now we're making that horse ridiculously thirsty. And they just are dying for that drink. They really, really, really want to have that drink. I want to stop sharing my screen for a quick second. I want to ask y'all a question. When I first started doing this work, there was something that happened that a lot of people found pretty surprising. And I want to make sure that I kind of name this idea and get your feedback on it. What happened was we had a lot of straight A high-flying kids who, when you introduce this sort of framework with them, whether through our curriculum or through these sort of nuggets in their own instruction, all of a sudden, the straight A high-flying kids struggled. At the same time, a lot of my struggling learners, so the ones who, you know those kids who, despite their best effort, have a hard time, like they try really hard, but they still have a hard time getting academic results? They did surprisingly well. And my behavior kids blew it up. My behavior kids became the rock stars. What do you think is going on? Why are my straight A high-flying kids having such a funky time when it comes to instruction that looks like this? Anybody want to enlighten me? You want to unmute yourself and share or drop it in the chat? Like, why is that funk a thing? Why is that happening?
Well, I'd just like to say something, if you don't mind. I agree with what you're saying, but I don't think it's a big blanket statement that all. I think there's there's a variables that are connected to the specific situations of each kid. And I do see what you're saying. I feel though those other students, the other students that were not doing well prior to this type of remote learning, I think that was what your question was.
No. So I'm talking more about why is it? It's kind of like a question I asked earlier. You got some kids who can do really well in traditional academic settings, when
Right.
they go into a CTE classroom, or when they go into a classroom where it's much more funk and it's not clear around the right or wrong answers, that they struggle more in that kind of construct.
Oh, I see.
And again, that's not everybody, right? But why do we have that gap?
I thought you were talking about specifically the situation we're facing right now. I get it. Okay.
So any thoughts on that though?
Well, yeah, I think it's because I think a lot has to do with the fact that in the CTE setting, we have a medical setting. In the CTE setting, I think there's, for my opinion, I think there's a lot more flexibility. I think there's a lot more of tapping into the specific interests of the student and cultivating what they know. And I think there's we do have standardized tests, obviously, but I think that they're in a position where they can really go beyond what even their own expectations were in that particular setting. I think it's but I also I think, all of our students go on to college as well, so they have it's not only the CTE experience, but they're also going on to college as well, and that's so it's my simple.
Appreciate that. Julio, you were gonna say something to add?
Yeah,
and then
I
I'll go
want
Andrew.
to add from the way that you framed it, and just from even our experience, going from regular in the building teaching to remote teaching. I think one of the things that I see this and how it can be effective is really giving student voice and providing the space where students don't feel that they have to provide responses and answers that fit in one box, but they really can dig deep and communicate, what they're thinking. And so that's kind of how I'm thinking about how this can be effective to really give students that space to communicate what their thoughts are, and not just to conform to a prescribed way of thinking.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And Julio, we'll take one more comment from you.
Yeah, I honestly think it's based off experience. Students who traditionally do well, whether it's like A+ students or whatever the case may be, they're used to this there being a right answer. They're used to studying and going through the whole process and trying to figure out what is the right answer and how can they go about doing so. Whereas the lower ended kids, the kids who struggle or maybe have the emotional, are always constantly thinking about new ways to try to adapt, new ways to try to think and try to keep up. And, you know, if there's, and sometimes I think every one of us was that kid one time where it's like, you didn't do the assignment. I have to come up with some kind of excuse. I have to come up with some kind of reasoning to like make it seem like it's not as bad, or, you know, I can make it up or something like that. So this is this constant thought of, you know, coming up with new and creative ideas to try to keep up with those who are already excelling. And then when you put those students who are in the A students in this new environment where now it's open to interpretation, they kind of get lost in that mix.
So let's play this out, right? A lot of times we've got these kids who you could like ask them a question and they have the answer like that, but they don't even know how they got there. If you're a struggling learner and Mr. Seale teaches you something and you got to find 14 other ways to look at it because you had no clue what Mr. Seale just said, you're learning how to learn. In a space where learning how to learn is an asset for this sort of CTE, critical thinking kind of environment. And here's the other part of that. I was never like student of the month, student of the week even. And I graduated #1 in my law school class. How was that possible that I graduated at the top of my law school class? Because my whole life was telling teachers, well, what had happened was, and what Julio just said, like when you say what had happened was, you end up having to think on your toes, being really creative, finding multiple ways to get to this thing. And I saw all these angles. So every time I looked at like a law problem was interesting. And it's the same thing in leadership. Law wasn't about learning the law. It was learning how to spot the issues. You have to find the issues. So here we are talking about how to get our kids to be problem solvers, when in the world, the people who are really getting it are really good at problem finding. They're trying to find the problem, not just solve it, but they're trying to ask the right questions and lead them to that problem that they can find. So again, this framework, just to kind of show you what it looks like to have a framework for this. And we're going to apply this to CTE in just 1 second. We want to be able to make a claim, back it up with evidence, look at different perspectives, right? Weigh those consequences. What would the world look like if? Right, that way I can kind of think beyond, like what would the world look like if, and then I want to have my conclusion that comes from this. Well, in the thinkLaw program, we call this draw plus C, where you make some sort of a decision, right? And if you look at this over here, this is a 3rd grade response, okay? You make this kind of decision where we go to like this whole idea of like, who should win? What should the outcome be? How should you make this decision? What choice should you make? And what's the rule? What's the scientific theory? What's the mathematical principle? What's the musical category? So like, is Old Town Road a country song or is it not? Well, what's the rule for a country song? It's got to be about country stuff. It's got to have a little guitar in it. If I throw Billy Ray Cyrus on a Jay-Z song, does that now make it a country song via the remix? I have arguments on each side. And then I want to ask that question, what would the world look like if? And if you can look at that 3rd grade response, he says, if the aunt wins her case, other kids will start getting sued. Kids don't have money or lawyers. And if I look at that as a paragraph as a 3rd grader, honestly, if that was a paragraph for a 10th grader, I'll be pretty happy with that structure and that level of reasoning. But we can set the structure and have my kids rise up to that level. So let's talk about what this actually plays out as when we start going through this a little bit deeper. As far as I know, none of you all went to law school, but you're still able to engage with this sort of construct. I know I put up this slide earlier, but I want to bring it up one more time to talk about the problem with grit. In education in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of talk around the importance of grit. If we're being real about grit, like a lot of our kids have already showed so much grit by the time they log into your Zoom room, by the time they end up in your classroom during regular times. So like, I don't really want to hear about grit. What it comes down to is, what are we doing to give our kids a reason to exercise their grittiness on a day-to-day basis? What's the why? What's the point? I think Donna referred to be able to kind of help kids make these connections. Like there's gotta be that intrinsic motivation. We gotta be able to answer that question, what's in it for me? Because some kids are just gonna comply for the sake of compliance. But I think as time goes on, there's less and less of that child in our public education system, period. And we got to be able to adapt and be flexible to the context that is changing. So I'm going to ask one last question of you all right? One last question. I've been doing this work now for 6 years, kind of like evangelizing around critical thinking. And at a certain point, I always get someone that says, Colin, you know what? I think critical thinking is awesome. I think what you're doing is dope, but here's the thing. My kids can't think critically. They don't think critically. And I worry that if I spend all this time trying to redesign my instruction around critical thinking, guess what? They won't think critically. And I heard this in rural districts, suburban, urban, high poverty, affluent, you name it. So I want to ask y'all a question. Just think about it, though. Don't type in the chat yet. Don't answer. Don't mute yourself. Take 10 seconds to think about the answer to this question. Just take 10 seconds, all right? Is there something particular going on with this generation in particular that is making critical thinking harder to grapple with than in previous generations? Take 10 seconds to answer. Don't type it in the chat. Think about it first. You might not agree, but I just want you to kind of rock wild with a second, just to answer the question. Do you think there's something particular happening with this generation that might make critical thinking harder than in the past? Because I hear these complaints all the time. All right, I'll take your answers now. What's going on? What's going on? Like, what's different today versus 10 years ago, 15 years ago? So a lot of people talk about like technology. They talk about technology as changing things and social media changing things. The idea that I can Google stuff, there's so much information, and it's an instantaneous sort of like feedback. And I like to ask this question of like, all right, like, does that really matter? I mean, they could Google it, but I have my encyclopedia. What's the difference? It just takes more time. So I might grapple with it a little bit more, but who cares? The information's at my fingertips. So like, why should it even matter? But okay, I don't have the patience to kind of work through. It's instant. Technology can help me as long as I'm also getting that skill set to discern what I'm looking through, right? So there's a different set of skills that's required for critical thinking, maybe, right? Where before finding the answer was part of it, and maybe we could have more reliability around where those answers would be. Now, with so many things not being as reliable, it might not be that they can't think critically. It's that we've got to make sure that they're prepared with the adequate skill sets to manage knowledge today. So before it was like getting the knowledge, now it's like managing the knowledge, okay? So what else is going on? What else is going on? What else is happening? Is anything different in our communities, in our family structures, in our schools that might have been different 10, 15 years ago? Robert?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm probably going to ramble on and like have two answers, but yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I think of, you know, at first I want to like blame technology, instant gratification, and they just want the answers to be given to them. But then I also think that, you know, I was thinking about this myself. Well, the reason why they're not critically thinking is because I'm not engaging them to critically think, right? That's like, so that's one part of it. And I also think that particularly the students I teach, 10th, 11th, and 12th, they've been raised in a system that hasn't like kind of challenged them to do that. But I also think too, like I've been thinking about this as you were speaking, Colin, is that, you know, one of the best ways that I could think of how I engage my students with critical thinking is when they create a resume, right? You know, the first thing they say is, I've never had a job. What can I put there? Right. So like when they create the resume, it like forces them to think about all the life experiences they had in relation to like work-based learning and internships. And, you know, I mean, that's like to critically think about your own experience and then to like sell yourself. So I think I said a lot of things, but I think that two things. One is maybe I'll speak for myself, you know, I'm not engaging in those critical thinking activities as much as I should, but moreover, I think I'm not labeling the critical thinking activities. Like when I teach resume writing, I could say, this is a critical thinking exercise. Like you critically, right? You know what I mean? So I don't think I'm explicitly telling the kids, hey, right now we're critically thinking, right? I don't know if that makes sense.
I know, that makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense.
Colin, may I say something? I'm the VE coordinator at my school. And my program, you know, it's a 3-year program. In 10th grade, they learn Microsoft Office. In 11th grade, they learn entrepreneurship, right? And when you combine those two subjects together, in the 12th grade, the COMLEX, where they're creating their own business. Here's where the critical thinking comes in. In the 12th grade, you have to create your business with VE program, and then you go out, you compete, you come up with the product, the service, and all that. All of that forces them to think really critically, because I'm in the 12th grade, I'm a facilitator. I lead, I guide, I suggest, but it's based on what your idea is. And I find that is where a lot of the challenges come in, because you need that skill and it's not fully developed. And
So
go ahead.
when you talk about that facilitator thing, I think that goes back to the comment that Robert was making, almost of like, I think a lot of times as educators, we're almost trained to like, we are the answer givers. We're the ones to come in and provide the answers. But if we're really the facilitators of knowledge, that's what it changes it up a little bit. I'm going to mute you. Can you mute yourself, Geraldine? Because you have kind of some feedback in the background. That's
Oh,
a little scratchy. Yeah. But part of where part of why I ask this question is oftentimes we start even thinking about parenting and how parenting has evolved. And I think about this idea of what that means as our kids get older. You know, I tell this story a lot about being at this place for brunch here in Phoenix with my mother-in-law. And my family was there, my mother-in-law was there, and my daughter loves going out to eat for breakfast because she gets to put an ungodly amount of syrup on her pancakes. And I remember she like tried to pour it out with her right hand and nothing was coming out. And then she tried to pour it out with her left hand with the syrup, and still nothing was coming out. But like the wheels were spinning. She had that eye of the tiger. You know, it's me and you, syrup. It's not gonna be you. It's gonna be me. And like I could tell she's thinking about it, and she's probably starting to realize that to get this syrup to come out, she's got to pour it all the way upside down because it's just so thick. But before she has a moment of glory, her sweet, sweet Nana is like, "Oh, come here, let me do this for you." And I'm like, "No!" I scream so loudly that everybody freezes in this restaurant. Right, the waitresses freeze, everybody at other tables are looking at this crazy dad. And I have two thoughts at that moment. The first thought is, perhaps I overreacted. But the second thought was, this is where it starts. This is where it starts. That sense of learned helplessness. When we decide that because of our ego and because of our needing to feel like the helper, we're not going to let our kids engage in that productive struggle. Because that productive struggle that we don't give them now translates to, can I get help? Can you help? Can you help? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And a sense of learned helplessness, because kids don't come into this universe helpless. They learn that. They learn that. So like by the time they come into you and it's like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do this. The idea of trying and failing seems terrifying because we've made it terrifying because we decided to solve a lot of their problems. But like the reality is, there's something to this that we all have something to do with, and we got to kind of claim this idea. And the one last question before I move on to the CTE applications is this. Any of y'all ever made this difference where you said, I teach some students who are street smart, but not book smart, and I teach some kids that are book smart, but not street smart? I'm not judging anybody, right? But has anybody like made that kind of comparison or observation looking at their kids before? I'm like, all right, like this kid is like really savvy and clever, could handle himself out there in the world, but like doesn't seem to be able to apply that here in school. But I got these kids over here that can get straight A's, but like God help them. I'm not even sure they could even get a job anywhere because of how ridiculous they are, whatever have you. I want to just say that like, I sometimes think of street smart as a phrase I try to avoid using, because street smart to me just means smart. And our failure to translate that into academic results in the classroom, whatever kind of classroom we're talking about, is really an adult problem, not a kid problem. And I don't think it's any less or more helpful if we got kids who are raised to be book smart, but can't actually translate that into anything that will work in the real world. The kid that like graduated #1 the year after me from law school could hardly even get a job because like there's not a huge market for being socially awkward. My degree is in computer science. A lot of the kids I went to school with that had straight A's, they found their careers plateaued because nobody really wanted a coding monkey, right? Like at the end of the day, my friends that had C's, they can talk to human beings and they can talk tech. They can lead sales teams, they can lead project design teams because they know how to empathize with the consumer. So there's a whole different set of skills that we got to think about that we're bringing to the table. So we can't even look at and play with that divide of street smart versus book smart. Neither is enough. Both require us to do a little bit more. Let's get into what that could look like. So if we can do this in our classrooms, looking at mistake analysis, I want to just give you the framework for it. Imagine being in a math class, and instead of like learning how to solve an equation or doing, oh, Colin did the equation wrong, what was his mistake? I can look at it a little bit different. And I can say that two people both did it wrong. Which one is more right? But just imagine, like, if your kids in middle school were coming to you after doing this sort of thing in like long division. These two long division problems are both wrong. Which one is more right? These two science experiments have faulty procedures. Which wrong is more right? Now they're grappling with funk. Well, one of my dudes in the Air Force was like, you know what? He's a commander of the base out here. And he's like, we use the same F-16 fighter manual for the last 50 years. The only difference is now it's a PowerPoint. But we need to train our pilots to be better, faster because of the pilot shortage. So this kind of construct of like, both of these procedures for evacuation are wrong. Which one is safer? Creates the moment for my people to collaborate, to have these conversations, to go a lot deeper with this construct. Can we do this in CTE? Of course we can. When we look at mistakes, there's different degrees of wrong. There's different consequences to wrong. I could look at this problem and say, what would the world look like if I valued computational accuracy more than conceptual understanding? I can look at this and think about the error analysis. Because if my kids can look at this, we can get to a point where we can dig a lot deeper. Are any of y'all wheel spinning? Are any of you seeing this? How you can use this in your day-to-day CTE instruction? Because this is where the rubber hits the road. I can tell you that out of all the thinking like a lawyer constructs, mistake analysis is the most popular. So I want you to think about, like, where can you do this sort of thing? And like, which one of these wrongs is actually more right? I want to go deeper. I know that people feel some kind of way about standardized testing, right? But here's my thing. When I look out into a classroom, I see kids who are going to be future engineers, future lawyers, future doctors, future nurses, and even future educators. And the reality is, we say what we want to say about tests, but like a lot of our kids need to do well on these tests to get where they need to go. I'm gonna go even further. We still live in a world where when it comes to credentials, we're often asking women, we're often asking people of color to work twice as hard to get half as far. So they can't just do all right. They got to do better than all right. They got to have stellar credentials. In the 6 years that I've been doing this, and I talk to other colleagues that do work similar to mine, and they're always surprised when they're asked, they hear how often I'm asked to provide my credentials, how often I'm asked to provide like a massive set of references to validate my work. So we know that tests are a part of this game. So we got to teach our kids not to just play the game, but get to a point where they can slay the game. What does that look like? Well, let's look at this shirt. Okay, let's look at this shirt. This shirt costs $20, but it's on sale for 10% off. What's the final price? Don't tell me the final price. Imagine you were Joe Schmo. And y'all know Joe Schmo. Joe Schmo always rushes. Joe Schmo always like kind of goes for the trick answer. Joe Schmo never really does all the work all the way through. So like imagine you're Joe Schmo. We're playing Family Feud and I surveyed 100 Joe Schmoes. What would be the number one incorrect answer for a shirt that costs $20, is on sale for 10% off, and we're asking what's the final price? Drop it in the chat. Number one wrong answer. $20, 10% off, what's the final price? What's Joe Schmo gonna say? So $2 is gonna be way up there. It's gonna be way up there because Joe Schmo might know a little bit about percent. 20.10 equals 2. Choice A is 2. Hey, can y'all also see 10? Joe Schmo sees the 20, sees the 10, just subtracts it. Forget about the percentage sign. Can we see 1990 maybe? So this idea of thinking about the potential wrong answers helps me out. Helps me think like a test maker. Here we are talking about all this test taking skills. What if we taught our kids to think like a test maker? That's a different degree of critical thinking. I don't know how many of y'all know about plumbing like that, but like looking at this, which of the following is suitable for testing a DWV system for leaks? Air, water, smoke, all of the above. What's the answer to this? Using your ability to think like a test maker. What's the answer to this have to be? I don't know nothing about this, but I know the answer off the bat. I already know. So Stephanie says A. Any other thoughts? Testing a system for leaks. D. So you look at this, right? And you realize a couple things that happen in here. So it's funny. That choice A right there is actually a trap because air is the most common way that you test plumbing pipes for leaks. But it's not the only way. So they're counting on Joe Schmo to see air, circle it, and move on. But we already know how Joe Schmo rolls, so we're not going to go out like that. If we're honest about what we're trying to do to prepare our kids for now and beyond, we've got to make sure they know this funk because it's like, I've got to think. I got to look at all the answers. I got to go a little bit deeper. When I start looking at this kind of thing, do I teach my kids how to deal with the word likely? And that might sound like, yo, that sounds like I'm dumbing down my curriculum. I'm like, you're not. You're giving my kids access. And you know what? Certain kinds of kids will be able to pay for very expensive prep courses for this outside of school. Other kids won't. So I'm here for the other kids. I'm here to make sure that my kids get the tools that they need to really excel within the system that's in front of them. So, and this is one of those cases where the reality is that like, it can be a lot of different lengths, but the most likely is 18 inches. So we're looking at how they're trying to trick you versus what's acceptable versus what's most likely. So when I start looking through this idea and I've got two answers that are both wrong, which one is more right, I can get to this point where I can really start to get my kids to grapple. I can get to this point where like my kids are not just talking about the what and the how to, but they're going into the why and the what if. So I want to hear this. I want to hear this. I would love to kind of just hear you all make a commitment to this. Like, what will you do to incorporate mistake analysis into what you're doing? Drop it in the chat and we'll move on. But I just want to make sure that we understand this construct enough so that you can see instructionally how you can do this. I even have school leaders that do this of like, you know what? Every year I train teachers on how to do incident reports and little stuff like that. We're going to start doing more mistake analysis, even in my teacher training. I've had like superintendent level people that I'm like, you know what? I want to use mistake analysis more with our leadership to talk about crisis management stuff, where we look at two crises that we're both managing correctly. Which one would have been a better choice given the circumstances? What do you all see yourselves doing differently when it comes to mistake analysis? Drop that in the chat. I'll continue, but definitely want to see your answers there. The second thing is something that I think a lot of us do a lot. Well, we might not call it that. We all know, we watch enough Grey's Anatomy to know a postmortem, right? A patient dies and we're sitting there and now we're analyzing what happened, because to know what happened, it helps the nurses in the future, it helps the administrators in the future, it helps the doctors in the future. Who doesn't it help? Whoever this dead person is. So a pre-mortem is essentially, we've gone the other way. We've already killed it. This idea that we had for our goal is already not met. This thing I wanted to do in this lesson, it already didn't happen. So if it's killed, I got to ask myself, what went wrong? What went wrong? So we know that things go wrong, but we have a hard time predicting what went wrong because we don't really think about that in that same way, okay? So I want you to try this out and think about pre-mortem stuff. So if your course is over and there was some sort of certification thing at the end, like what went wrong? Why didn't they pass? Why didn't they make it? And a lot of times when we get into this, we're getting into a point where we're actually able to plan much more intentionally than we did before. So when we start thinking about anytime we have a project, anything we have something that's complicated, asking ourselves, not how might this go wrong, but trick my brain into saying it actually was a failure already. What failed? Because if we're being real, what is an experienced teacher? Someone who's messed up a whole lot. That's what usually experience is. And when you have the benefit of hindsight, you know, like, yeah, I'm not doing that again. I'm not doing that again. But doing a pre-mortem allows me to say, I'm not doing that again before I even do the thing to begin with. So we look at pre-mortems as a strategy that's just kind of a mindset sort of structure. I want to make sure I get to investigation and discovery, because asking the right questions as a teacher is great, but having my kids ask the right questions of themselves is next level. Here's a case a lot of you might be familiar with, all right? It's the early 1990s. And anyone that knows the ins and outs of this case, don't even spoil it, all right? I just want to rock with y'all for a second. Chris goes to this drive-through. he takes his grandmother gets the coffee, they come to a complete stop. She sits down, she opens up the coffee to put in cream and sugar, and she ends up spilling the coffee on herself and gets really badly burned. Okay, really badly burned. Question I have for you is this. Forget about whether she should win. I want to instead talk about what happens in the next 30 minutes. What happens in the next 30 minutes? The coffee spills, got it. What happens in the next 30 minutes? In order. What's the first thing that's gonna happen? This older woman is sitting there and she spills the coffee on herself. What's gonna happen very next step? Drop it in the chat. Like, what happens? She spills super hot coffee on herself. What happens? Some people say, well, somebody called the ambulance. But okay, but what actually happens in this scene? She's in this parking lot. So she's screaming. Does she sit there in a pool of coffee? Probably not. She's stepping outside. And she's screaming and hollering. And what's happening when people see this old lady screaming and hollering? So back in the day, right, early 90s, like it might be different in today. 2021, they'd be like, ooh, this lady is suffering. Look at her. But I got this whole live feed going, so I'm just trying to capture these to get my comments. But like back then, they might actually get some first aid, try to get some help. So we look at this. And unless they got that Zach Morris style cell phone, they're probably making a call to 911 in the restaurant using a payphone, whatever have you. So we realize like maybe they have a car, so maybe they're not calling 911. They're just going straight to the hospital. Who knows? But I'm starting to piece together my witness list. And suppose I wanted to actually now piece together this story. If I'm McDonald's and I'm trying to defend my case, or if I'm Stella and I'm trying to make my case, what witnesses might I call? Not just the eyewitnesses. Let's get some money, people. Like, forget about the minimum wage people that work there. Forget about like all the eyewitnesses to the scene. Let's presume we have them. Who are some creative witnesses I might be able to come up with here? For instance, I might want to talk to Stella's primary care doctor, who can tell me where her state was before these burns. Right? So like that person wasn't on the scene, but they'll be helpful. Who else would be helpful, whether you're McDonald's or Stella, to talk to? Drop some creative witnesses in that chat. Who's some witnesses that can really help me out here? Forget about the ones that were all there. We're going to presume we all saw it. We got the story of it. So whoever was at the hospital, whoever saw that. But, you know, the injuries here, I would say even that is kind of obvious, right? We see that. We're going to have somebody for that. Like, who's maybe more non-obvious? What is this case even about? She's suing because she got burned by this coffee. So again, I could look at her doctors and get those people to evaluate that. So I want to know who makes the coffee. I want to know the coffee manufacturer. Was like McDonald's adding lava to the coffee, or were they using it accurately? I want to talk to the person that made the coffee cup. I want to talk to the manufacturer of the car to know if the passenger seat had a defective slidey thing. I want to make sure I talk to like, I'm suing McDonald's because their coffee might have been too hot. So who else might I want to talk to if I really want to get big money? Who would be helpful to talk to if I want to get big money? Big money. Suing McDonald's because the coffee might be too hot. The server, I don't know that the server is going to give me big money, but the server is just someone that works at a McDonald's. But big money? Big. I go straight to the CEO. I go to court. I want to look at the hamburger college syllabus for the coffee making class and see what they're trained about that coffee. But I want to go deeper. Other people not related to the case. What people? What other people? Some people say customers. What other customers? The other coffee drinkers? What coffee drinkers? The other elderly ones? What if McDonald's got tired of giving out the senior discount? So to just burn away all the old people. Who knows? I want to know what's going on here. But here's the thing. This becomes a low floor, high ceiling construct. Because when we start digging deeper, we want to talk to Starbucks, Burger King, Wendy's. We want to know what's going on to dig a little bit deeper, go beyond. So we're giving everybody a floor around critical thinking, but we're allowing our more creative kids to start pushing towards the ceiling. Now, also, what if I decided now, yo, I gotta go, I got things to do, I'm done here. You don't want to stop. You're not happy. And I call it the law and order moment. We've created a law and order moment. How? Y'all ever been flipping channels and you watch the first 2 minutes of a Law and Order episode? It's a hot mess. Every episode is the same thing. Someone's jogging through Central Park. Oh no, dead body in the bush. And then the detective makes some sort of snarky comment. Then it's dun, 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 dun. Next thing you know, you're like, there goes the next 58 minutes of my life because I'm not leaving here. I got to see this through. Well, we don't have to give instructions straight through. We can pause. We can press pause. We can have our kids make predictions and inferences about what they think is going to happen next in terms of what they might have to do next. If they're in culinary, what they might need to add next. What's going to happen to this thing that I'm baking if I do this thing next? So I can create those moments. And now I know by pressing pause that the coffee was actually really, really hot. How hot? 3rd-degree burns are getting you within seconds of touching your skin. 3rd-degree burns, you can typically see bone, all right? You go even deeper, just so you know, it's 20 degrees hotter than other restaurants. 30 degrees hotter than coffee you make at home. Coffee's supposed to be hot, but not that hot. Go even deeper, 700 other people had 3rd-degree burns from the coffee over the last decade. 700 other people in the last decade had 3rd-degree burns. I'll go even deeper. These were not ordinary burns, and these were not an ordinary injury. She was injured in the most private areas, and it was so bad, the lady needed to get skin grafts. That's where you take skin from one part of the body and put in another place. Took her 2 years to recover. She was never the same. She was already a small woman. Now she's even smaller. So I look at this. Do I have more questions? Of course we do. We look at that temperature. We're like, well, why was it so hot? We look at those complaints. When I tell you that there were 700 people that had 3rd-degree burns over the last 10 years, what are the questions that come up in your mind? 700 people had 3rd-degree burns from McDonald's coffee in the last 10 years. What are some of the immediate questions that start to pop up in your head automatically? 700 complaints over the last 10 years. Why didn't y'all do anything? At the same time, maybe it's just the math teacher in me, but I'm like, well, what about the denominator? What was my denominator? Was my denominator 700 children? Where did this happen? Was it 10 years in this one restaurant? 10 years in this region? Was it really like 70 a year? Or was it like McDonald's changed some policy 2 years ago and then it had this massive spike? So I start realizing there's so much funk in the digging deep into this. And now I can go deeper, right? And I can tell you, y'all know those kids in your class that are really brilliant, but have like no emotional intelligence? Where you look at this kid and you're like, oh man, you're not gonna have no friends, are you? You just kind of look at them and you just kind of see this thing play out sometimes. Their head witness from McDonald's quality assurance was that guy. He got on the stand, he had to answer that question. Well, why didn't y'all do something sooner? And he said, 700 represents 0.000000057% of all cups of coffee we served. That number is statistically insignificant. And at that point, the jury clutches their pearls. Because you just told me that the intense pain and suffering of 700 human beings was a rounding error and didn't matter. And I want to talk about this because y'all know who this is. It's not me, but do y'all know who this is? Actually, a fellow graduate of Bronx High School of Science, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Neil deGrasse Tyson actually spoke at my graduation at Bronx Science. And I love Neil deGrasse Tyson because he's always coming with it. He's always bringing that fire, always like making things so accessible to people. You know, astrophysics for people in a hurry. The way he breaks things down is just incredible. But one day he kind of got a little off. This was like 24 hours after the shooting in Dayton, Ohio, which happened 24 hours after the shooting in El Paso. He wrote this tweet. In the last 2 days, we lost 34 people to mass shootings. Also, in any 2 days, we lose 500 to medical errors, 200 to the flu, and so on and so forth. And he has this comment, people often respond more to spectacle than to data. With a tweet like this, was he more concerned with being right or doing right? Clearly being right, although I don't even know how this counts as being right, how you could compare mass execution to random medical errors, right? But this is what we're trying to avoid. We want to make sure that our kids understand that doing right is so much more important than being right. Because the idea is McDonald's staff was critical thinkers. They made that coffee that hot because it turned out you can get the same strength of coffee with a fewer number of beans when you brew it at an unsafely high temperature. Moreover, Stella was not no gold digger. She just wanted her money for her medical bills, $20K. And this multi-billion-dollar corporation said, you know what? Here's $800. Have a good life. So when I look at this idea, getting our kids to think about what they need to know, who they need to talk to, what do they need in terms of physical evidence, what questions do they need to ask, what evidence should they collect, what can I do to prevent it? Like, we need to have them to have their own voices in their head. They need to own their own questions. We got to apply this to all sorts of things that apply to our field when it comes to current events or whatever have you. But the more you can create that habit of getting our kids to ask those questions, the more tangible the critical thinking is that we need to have them have. If we're being real, no one's getting fired from a welding job because they don't know how to weld usually. It's usually these soft skills. How do I connect with people? How do I manage this funk? How do I lead in crisis and under uncertainty? So the same thing applies to that level of conflict. There's some drama going on. Who you need to talk to? What do you need to look at? What questions do you need to ask to make sure you get that level of clarity? If our kids get this habit, it's not just about critical thinking to succeed academically, to succeed in career, but it's to succeed in relationship building, both professional and personal. So out of what we covered, would love to hear, how did I piss off the boss? Absolutely right. What do you see yourself being most excited about putting in immediately? We did a lot of different perspectives. We talked about mistake analysis. We talked about these investigations where we press pause. What do you see yourself implementing the most immediately? And I'll also take any questions and answers we have in these last 2 minutes, because that's basically where we're wrapping up. So what questions do you have? And what do you see yourself applying immediately going forward out of these different strategies? Mistake analysis. I forgot to mention, I asked you that one question about kids and critical thinking, and I asked you to wait 10 seconds. Wait time matters too, guys. We got to make sure we give our kids time to think. I don't know about you, but when that bell used to ring, I was on fire. I was like sweating by the time class was done. We could slow down. We could ask some questions that are open-ended and give our kids 10 seconds to go there, okay? Anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question or like add in this with a comment before we go? We got about a minute left. I want to point out one more thing too, though, while I do that. You notice that in my workshops, like I ask you to participate a lot. You probably don't go to a lot of sessions at any kind of conference or any kind of PD where you being asked to speak is so much a thing that's happening. I presume expertise of all of you all. I need you all to presume expertise in your students. Presume that there's a set of answers that they already have, that they can bring things to the table. They've got value, they've got knowledge, they've got experience, okay? Okay, a lot to mistake analysis, and I wasn't surprised. I know that fits in really well. I talk about this in a lot more detail in the Thinking Like a Lawyer book for you all that want to check that out. But any other questions or thoughts before we wrap up? I'm going to make sure that all the things that we did, you'll get handouts for them. If you haven't already gotten them, they should have been in the schedule thing. But really, really enjoy having a chance to speak to you. Well, Julio, what you're talking about, really, this is what they do in business school, right? They do the case method in business school for this very exact reason. So thank you all so much. I hope you got something practical about it. If you have any questions and want to dig deeper, please feel free to email me at colin@thinkLaw.us. Thank you all for participating. Thank you all for the work you are doing. You know, as a Brooklyn kid who grew up all throughout New York City school systems, I look back with so much gratefulness for what the work entails. So appreciate you all so much. Please do keep in touch and let me know how I could be of a resource. And again, you can follow me at Colin E. Seale on Twitter, at Colin Seale on Instagram if you have any questions going forward, or email me at Colin@thinkLawUS if you want to dig deeper. All right? Really
Thanks so
glad to
much,
hear you're able to
Colin.
get talent. All right. Take care, Corinne.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
You know, Brooklyn got to do it, Patricia. You know how we do. You know.
Thanks again, Colin. That was
All
great.
right. You take care.